the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
Hello and a belated Happy New Year to all our lovely listeners and viewers. This is the first Downtown podcast of 2026. I'm Jim Hancock, Downtown's political editor and former political editor at Granada and BBC Northwest. Also with me is Joe Phillips, political commentator on many platforms, including GB News and 5 Live, and former press secretary to Lib Dem leader Paddy Ashdown. Now, Downtown CEO Frank McKenna can't be with us today, but he's already made his mark on the politics of the new year and Downtown's campaigning, as we shall explain later on. But that's in connection with domestic politics, but we'll come to that later because inevitably, despite important things happening in the UK, the international situation over the new year has been spectacular in many respects. Difficult to know where to start, Joe, but let's begin with Iran. And the thing I'd like to sort of get your reaction to is the reluctance of the media coverage that I've seen to actually look to what might happen, because we've seen this time and again, the poor people of Iran rising up against their theocratic government, but always lacking a coherent alternative. Now, that seems to me to be the case again this time. Although the son of the former Shah of Iran, who was deposed in 1979, has been urging resistance from his home in America, and trying to project what might happen here, it would be very interesting to hear from you. I mean, there's this delicate balance. Trump once again has sort of muddied the waters by saying if anyone's killed, we'll do something. Well, hundreds have been killed apparently, and nothing has actually happened from the United States. But that's part of the problem, isn't it? Because the theocratic leadership are desperate to say this isn't the internal Iranian people. All these people on the streets are stooges for America. And if America starts bombing or the United Kingdom starts getting involved, I mean, I can bore you to death with the history of the United Kingdom's relationship with Persia as it used to be. And it's a difficult one, to say the least. But so here we've got the people rising up, no clear leader, and it's not clear to me how, if it was the son of the Shah, is he going to be parachuted into Tehran and people are going to rally to him? It seems as if the danger is that we're going to go through another cycle of this where the poor people of Iran eventually are suppressed and the same things carry on.
Well, yes, and you're absolutely right, Jim, because as is so often the case, you see an uprising, you see a rebellion, and unless there is a clear leader, as we saw in Syria just over a year ago, for instance, then it's very difficult to see what comes next. I think the difference between these protests, the current protests, and the ones that have happened sporadically but regularly over the last 10 years, for sure. This is about the cost of living. This isn't about, there's the hardline religious Islamic fundamentalists that forbid women from going out and, they've got to be covered up and things, because where there's been protests before, there has been a slight relaxation. But this is about something much more fundamental. And as happened in the Arab Spring, it started off with market traders, and it's about the cost of living and the fact that they can't sell anything because nobody's got any money. So this is a much bigger issue, but you're absolutely right. Where do you go from here? And I mean, there is something so mind-bogglingly staggering that Trump says, if you harm any protesters, I will get involved. This is a man who's allowing his own ICE forces to shoot dead unarmed people in their cars. So, pots and kettles don't even begin to cover it. And, the Iranians, they might think it would be quite nice to have the son of the Shah back. But of course, there will be many people who remember what a terrible, corrupt regime the Shah presided over. And that's why he was ousted. And I think, do you want America involved? I would say absolutely not. So who do you look to? Iran is dodgy, let's say, and does have links with Russia and China. Is Russia likely to get involved? Is China likely to get involved? Is the Ayatollah likely to stand down, the supreme leader? The president, of course, who is, he's a sort of titular figure, but is much more moderate. And it may well be that the sensible option would be that the supreme leader retires. He's very elderly and quite ailing, and a more moderate leader comes in to oversee a better change. They improve the cost of living, and that's much more peaceful. But if you end up with foreign countries getting involved without a clear leader of the opposition, you're going to end up with Afghanistan all over again.
Yes, I mean, I think you would want to qualify moderate. I mean, this is you're talking about the president of Iran as opposed to the supreme leader.
Yes.
I mean, he is more moderate, but I don't think we'd want to dismantle the theocratic structure of the state, or maybe he would, but that does seem like a possible way through, because the problem with the son of the Shah is that apparently he has has connections with Netanyahu of Israel, which of course is absolute poison to large sections of Iran. And mentioning Israel, of course, we need to be aware of the possible dangers here of its spreading, because there is a thought that the theocracy, if it starts to really crumble away before it goes, will try and unite the country by confecting some sort of some Israeli conspiracy and start firing rockets at Israel again. So the situation in the Middle East could be quite unstable in that respect.
No, absolutely. And I think, 'twas ever thus. If you look at Iran, you look at Iraq, you look at Israel, you look at the fallout between the Saudis and UAE over Sudan, over Yemen. It is so fractured and so precarious at all times, and has been for so many years. And because you've got meddling players from outside, be they Israel or America or Europe, or Russia or China or India, come to that, it all becomes much more complicated. I mean, I think we have to wait and see whether Trump is actually going to do something. And in that case, are we looking at something where the Iranians with their supporters would then hit back at American targets, at which point you then open a whole other can of worms, because all the people who voted for Trump voted for putting America first, not getting involved in foreign wars. And so far, he's managed to bomb Nigeria, Syria, Venezuela will come on to in a minute with that operation there. And if he starts getting involved in Iran again, then I think, the American people might have something else to say.
Things do move so fast that you've almost had to remind us of the extraction of Maduro from Venezuela. But as we haven't had a chance to chat over the Christmas period, what was your reaction to that?
Probably like most people, but probably not as much as President Maduro. Absolutely stunned. It was, if you look at it from the point of view of a military operation, it was absolutely brilliantly executed, and it caught everybody by surprise. 32 people were killed, Cubans, who acted as his guards. Now, okay, Maduro was awful, and there are many, many arguments who say he was there illegitimately, that he stole the election, that he was corrupt, and so on and so forth, and not a friend of the Venezuelan people. Well, that's fine. You sort of wonder, although it doesn't take you very far to go from one oil well to another with Trump, that actually, if you really wanted to take somebody out because you wanted to support the Venezuelan people, then the person you help, support and put in power is the opposition leader, who of course won the Nobel Peace Prize, which Donald Trump thought was his. You put her in, and then you support her with all the edifices of civil society and state and trade and all the rest of it. You don't put in Maduro's number two, who is as hardline as he was, possibly not so corrupt. And in the end, you can see that this is just about oil. But it's much further than that, Jim, because it clearly is against international law, even though Keir Starmer, who is as far as I know, human rights lawyer of some note, finds it very difficult to condemn it. You know, whatever you think, you don't go and kidnap the leader of another country. And I think this intervention, you know, can you be isolationist and interventionist at the same time? Well, Donald Trump thinks you can ride both those horses.
Yeah, but it seems to be, in a way, a fairly skillful operation, in the sense that the deputy has been sworn in, and it seems that she's prepared to work with the United States, even on these projects for oil companies. We'll come on to whether the oil companies are actually going to go in or not. And obviously, the United States has avoided putting boots on the ground. I mean, that's what they want to avoid. And there hasn't been a sort of inflamed anger by the Venezuelan people. Most of the reaction seems to have been quite favorable. So on this particular thing, I know you're critical of Trump in terms of international law, but aren't there aspects of this which have been quite skillfully done by the United States?
No, in terms of an operation, as I said, it was done skillfully. You know, they knocked out all the power, they went in, it was completely a surprise mission, and they achieved what they wanted to, which was to extract and remove Maduro and his wife. But, you know, Jim, if you and I think back to the overthrow of the Ceausescus in Romania, for instance, and that happened because of the people of Romania. Now, you know, there's a whole difference between taking and also, you know, we know what happens when other countries, including Britain, think, oh, this person is dreadful, we must have regime change. Well, look what happened in Iraq, look what happened in Afghanistan, look what happened in Libya. You know, we've done it without a follow through. And although you say that Dulcie, whatever her name is, the current acting president, has said she's willing to work with America, of course she will. She hasn't got any other option but to say that, has she? But is she on the side of the Venezuelan people, or is she on the side of, you know, doing the best in order to not meet the same fate as her benefactor Maduro?
Yeah, just one final thing on this. I understand that the oil companies that Trump so confidently said were going to be moving in to start exploiting the Venezuelan oil, and we should say, I mean, I was quite staggered to see this. When you look at the world oil reserves, Venezuela has got far more oil than Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
so it's really important.
It's the richest oil country in the world.
But apparently they're reluctant to go in because, you know, they've had their assets stolen twice by Chavez and then by Maduro, and they're going to need some real reassurances before they start moving in and exploiting the oil.
Well, yeah, and also I'm not an expert in oil, but I understand that this oil is very heavy, so it needs an awful lot of refinement before you can use it. And whilst you might have access to it, you can't just pump it out of the ground and, you know, stick it in a petrol can. You've actually got to spend a lot of time. So that requires long-term investment. You know, well, how long is Trump going to be there? How long is Venezuela going to be like this? And, you know, you say there hasn't been a lashback, but actually the American government advised all US citizens to leave Venezuela over the weekend. And if Trump then decides to go into Colombia, or other parts of Latin America, then, you know, you've got another tinderbox. And I think the other thing is that, you know, all of these events are happening, as you say, at breakneck speed. So sometimes it's not even possible for us sitting at home in UK to have an idea of what's going on the streets of Venezuela. Because at the moment, you know, we're all looking at Iran. We've stopped looking at Gaza. We barely look at Sudan. You know, never mind all the other tinderbox flashpoints around the world.
Yeah, I don't want to be put in the role of a Trump apologist, but let me just push back on you in one more respect. That this actually isn't an aberration in American policy. I mean, everyone's been talking about the Monroe Doctrine that was put in place by the president in 1823. I remember, of course, reporting on the speech when he made it.
I think you passed him the quill pen to sign it, didn't you?
Indeed, when he said that, you know, there was this. This was the infant United States. It wasn't really a very powerful power at the time, and it was largely to try and see off the Spanish and the French from the Americas at that time. But he put that in place. But bringing the story much further up to date, you know, there was the invasion of Panama, there was the invasion of Grenada. This is Trump is not an aberration in this respect, and obviously President Kennedy nearly took the world to nuclear war because of his concern about what was going on in Cuba in 1962. So we need to put this in some historical context. In this respect, Trump isn't an aberration of American policy in the Americas.
No, although you might note that he's changed the Monroe Doctrine to the Donroe Doctrine, which somehow cheapens it, like everything else he touches. No, I know, but there is a point. This is old-fashioned imperialism, colonialism. You go into a foreign country, a sovereign state, you remove the president, whatever you may think of that president, or how he got there, and then you go in with the sole purpose of using their resources to line your own or your country's pockets. Now, what is the difference between Trump doing that and what Putin's doing in Ukraine?
Well, that's the thing about international authority, and there's so much to talk about. Let's just pick that one up, because I think that is a very sound point, because we're now in this new world order. I mean, it's 100 years since there was a peace conference in Europe in 1925, after all the ramifications of the First War. I'm going to write about this in my blog this week. All the ramifications, all the real bitterness of the First World War had not faded, but I mean, it was beginning to settle. And by 1925, the countries of Europe got together, and it looked like as if real peace might come. And that led on to the League of Nations and then the United Nations. But you really feel now as if we're going back to that situation where, blocs, empires, China, Russia, the United States, do what they want to do. And, whilst in the 19th century, there was a century of peace, whilst the great empires carved up Africa, eventually it culminated in the catastrophe of the First World War. So do you really think that and Trump last week withdrew the United States from 55 United Nations institutions?
I think it's more than that, yeah.
I mean, do you really? I mean, because the League of Nations eventually, as the 30s went on, became increasingly irrelevant as aggression took over. Do you really think we're on that sort of path?
Yeah, I do. I think, we've often said, not just us, but, other political commentators as well, that the world, the political plates are shifting, but they're shifting at such speed, as you said in the introduction, Jim, with Trump driving it and the people around Trump, because to them it's a video game, it's not real. It's like, yeah, let's go, it's just revolting. And what you're seeing is a total fragmentation, and we've seen it over the last year really with Trump's attacks on NATO. I mean, yes, I think the UN, which grew out of the League of Nations, is toothless and largely irrelevant, unfortunately. But I think all of those things that were set up in the wake of the First and Second World Wars, were set up with the right idea, but that is fragmenting. And we're now looking at the very real possibility of America, a NATO member, invading or forcibly taking another NATO member, which is Greenland, of course, which is, belongs to Denmark. So I do think all of those things are really quite worrying. And I think Keir Starmer and other European leaders need to be really, really clear that, Europe is on its own. When it comes to this, we cannot any longer rely on America. They are not a trusted ally. I will personally have very grave doubts anyway as whether they should be part of the Five Eyes, sharing real-time intelligence information. And I think, the Canadians also feel the same. And whilst you've got sort of mavericks like Giorgia Meloni of Italy, for instance, but who manages to play quite a good game by keeping Trump on side, and has brought a level of stability to Italy, which it hasn't had for very many decades. And you've got the mavericks like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who, of course, is facing elections later this year. Europe is in itself fractured, but, never before has the threat been so great. But, we can't see where the threat is. We assume it's Russia, but it could be China. But in actual fact, it could be from America, maybe not directly. But what you see when events like this happen, when you have what's happened in Venezuela, the uprising in Iran, we in the West have lost our moral authority. We cannot criticize Putin for going into Ukraine if Trump is doing exactly the same in Venezuela.
But I don't think the answer to it is for us to withdraw from the intelligence community sharing with the United States. I mean, that Putin would love that.
Well, of course he would. And, an awful lot of this, Jim, is caused by Putin, and that's what's so frightening. The problem is that I think you've got Trump, who is mercurial, and that's putting it mildly, but surrounded by idiots who are there for sort of gung-ho, let's show them who's boss, and thinking the whole thing's like a Hollywood movie. You've got Putin, who has shown time and time again that he's very happy to play a very long game, and he'll sow dissent and dissatisfaction, and break up the sort of social cohesion in Europe and elsewhere. You've got Ukraine still going on with no sign of an end in sight. You've got the Middle East, as you said earlier, absolutely on eggshells, and who knows what's happening in Gaza at the moment. We know that the Israelis have said they're not even allowing, really well-respected Doctors Without Borders and other aid organisations to operate there anymore. But like I said, we're spinning. We're not concentrating or focusing on that, because the next thing Trump does, we're looking over there. It's absolute distraction and destruction all around. And, it's very difficult to see how you hold a steady line and battle against all of these things that are coming in, like a bit like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. And I think it's difficult for Keir Starmer. I think it's difficult for Macron, who have, both got their own domestic issues to deal with. And I think, we have to be really thinking about our own resilience as a country and where our future lies.
But that's a fairly narrow view. Our country. I mean, I just want to put a sort of global picture to you, that it's quite extraordinary. You can see if we're moving into a new age of empires, you can see China, Russia, possibly India, the United States. But then you've got Europe with huge resources, huge intelligence, huge history. As a sort of the vacuum, the split, divided, when it could be a united force in the world, not being able to do this. And what I would suggest is, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there needs to be, I mean, if we are, not to rely on the United States any longer, there's got to be a huge shift in mentality.
Yeah.
And also in spending, because at the weekend it's becoming abundantly clear that for all the nice words that the government are putting out, and will be 2035 will raise spending to 5% and so on, there's no sign of that happening, that the pressures for welfare spending are so great that we're never going to do it. But unless all the countries of Europe that have piggybacked on the United States to some extent, Trump has a point, and has luxuriated on its welfare policies to bring high standards of living to the nations of Western Europe, and neglected our defence, unless there's a huge reversal of mental attitude to that we are going to say, right, we're all going to come together. I used to laugh at the idea, because I didn't like it, because I've always seen the European Union as a peaceful area of coexistence. And when there was talk, and there was a lot of talk, still is to some extent, of an EU army, I was against it. That's almost what we've, if you're thinking about the long term, we need to get back into Europe. The European Union needs to develop an army. We need to suppress our welfare spending and start spending on military. That's the only way that we can do without the United States. And in the meantime, just to finish off, I think we've got to be a little bit more careful about our relationship with the United States. And in respect of Greenland, can I put forward this idea to you? That one sign of Europe beginning to move down the path I've just indicated would be to say to the United States, yes, we will, more modestly than the United States, but we will help you. And the Danes would have to lead on this out of the respect for their territorial ownership of the country at the moment, that Europe will start to supply with the United States soldiers and equipment for Greenland, and we do it collaboratively with the United States rather than all this nonsense about Trump taking it over.
Well, yes, all of those things. I mean, first of all, America has got military bases on Greenland anyway. Some of them have been mothballed. There's nothing to stop America, revitalizing those and still having a military base there. They don't need to own the bloody country. But, somebody wrote at the weekend, well, we know why, because the Arctic ice is melting. Obviously, climate change is a complete hoax, as Donald Trump says. But underneath there, there'll be lots of minerals and oil. I mean, it's like some ghastly, distorted Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. So, Greenland, yes, America could re-establish its military bases, which are already there. And yes, we could be collaborative. But I think the point you make, Jim, is the absolute fundamental point. And that's not unique to Britain. I think it's right across Europe. Mentally, we have to change our attitude. And, it's not just about cutting welfare and spending it on warfare, which is the, cheap and easy tabloid choice. It's actually about having a country that is resilient, which means a healthy population, a population that can work, can fight if necessary. And it doesn't mean, going into tanks and going into trenches. It means about, looking after things, fixing things, mending things. It's about keeping us resilient right across. And I think if Europe misses this chance, and I think, it wasn't Trump who started the complaints against Europe. It goes back to Kennedy, in the 60s, saying Europe's got to grow up and recognise that America is not always going to be, bailing you out. And to a certain extent, and, you could put this as well in the rise of populism around the world, is that the progressive, liberal, wishy-washy people like us have for too long probably sat back and just dismissed the views and concerns of other people. That's why we've seen the rise of reform. That's why we saw UKIP. That's why we've seen, the rise of populism across Europe and across the world. And people are a bit lost and a bit desperate. And when you are like that, and when that is being fueled by bad actors like Russia and China through algorithms on bots, the easy thing to do is to put your head in your hands and say, I want somebody to take this away, whether that is Putin or Farage or Trump or, whoever it might be.
Just one final word before we move on to domestic politics. On Ukraine, we've now got to a position where Starmer has backed the idea of British troops and French troops helping out on a ceasefire line in Ukraine, which at least has the virtue of clarity on Britain's position. But to me, if there isn't a flicker of a prospect of a ceasefire, that's been extinguished by that proposal. I'm not blaming Starmer. I think that's a practical thing we need to do, is to offer that sort of a tripwire to stop further Russian aggression. But the Russians have made it absolutely clear that it's a triple red line not to have NATO troops in Ukraine. So do you see anything other than a continuation of this war, because Putin thinks he can edge forward all the time, and it's totally unacceptable to him to have British and French troops on a ceasefire line?
Well, I think, the idea that British and French troops on a ceasefire line is, it's a meaningless thing, because actually Starmer would have to get through that through the Commons. It would have to go through Parliament. You cannot deploy troops like that without a vote in the Commons, as we know. And I'm not sure that he would win that vote, to be perfectly honest.
Really?
Yeah. Because for a variety of reasons, because you've got people, the hawkish wing of Parliament, and this is across all parties, would say we haven't got the resources. We simply do not have the resources within our armed forces to deploy people. And you do this sort of deployment, as happened in Bosnia. I mean, that was UN for sure. But, you've got to be there for an awfully long time. So then something else happens and there's a skirmish somewhere. You haven't got the resources. So there's all of that. Plus, you've then got on the sort of the more dove-like side of the argument, the people who just think, oh, no, we shouldn't get involved. We mustn't get involved in a war. Let's knit socks instead. So there's all of that going on. And Macron would probably have the same in France, and he is fighting for his political life too. So I think
Donald Trump is right. Donald Trump is right. Europe is a basket case. They're not prepared to help us out. They expect the Americans to entirely guarantee the ceasefire.
No, I think he's not right. He is right in the sense that he has repeated what, as I said, Kennedy, both Bushes and Obama have said over the years, is that, Europe needs to get its act together and stop relying on America. Well, I think that has been made abundantly clear. The next stage, and I think this is the stage where it needs to be speeded up, is possibly an idea of a European army, or a European force, which doesn't necessarily have to be a fighting force, but it can be a defensive force, it can be a peacekeeping force or something like that. I mean, the other question, of course, about Ukraine, if you did get to a ceasefire, what is the role of the UN, which, of course, is still in position around the Balkans, not in any number that like it used to be in the days when Paddy and I were there all the time, or you've got them around parts of the Middle East between Lebanon and Syria and Israel. So, you've got UN forces, UN troops as peacekeepers. Where do they fit into all this? Because that has been incredibly silent on any sort of a ceasefire. And Putin would find it very difficult to complain about, I mean, he would find a reason to do it, but you can't complain about a UN peacekeeping force in the same way as you could arguably legitimately.
That's a very good point. I've not heard it made anywhere else. I mean, I think it's partly because I and perhaps other commentators are so despairing of the future of the United Nations for all the reasons we've discussed that it had never occurred to me. But of course, that was and technically is the role of the United Nations.
Absolutely. And that, when Yugoslavia was in smithereens and was being, absolutely broken up, and I was heavily involved there, as you know.
Well, because Paddy was the High Representative.
Well, yes, but I mean that was after after he stopped being an MP, and he, and I wasn't working for him then. But but in the run up to that, the UN actually moved quite quickly. And if you remember, there was the Daytona Peace Accord, which Paddy famously scribbled out on a serviette in a dinner somewhere. But you've got to have somebody like him. And there are people like that, across the world who say, hang on a minute, this is how we need to do it. You need a sort of a military mind, not a political or a technocratic mind, which I think is the problem across Europe. You need somebody who goes, right, let's go to the UN. You then, of course, have the whole thing about the ridiculous, slow, glacial pace of any decision making at the UN. But, when I was in Sarajevo, there were troops from Kenya there. There were troops from Canada. There were troops from France. They used to wash their Land Rovers in Evian, of course. But joking aside, that actually helped. And I know the Balkans is not, it is not secure and in a state of peace, but it did manage to keep some sort of transition period going.
Right. Well, you referred earlier on the need in order for us to play this new role in the troubled world, to have a good basic economy. So let's turn to domestic issues now, and this whole question of U-turns, because we have seen the government in its short life do some spectacular U-turns, ministers defending policies until they weren't defended anymore. And I refer to things like winter fuel, suggestion of putting up income tax, the farmers, family tax, and then the latest thing which we're expecting is on pubs. Now, can I, what's your view on this? Because you can say, oh, this is weakness, push Starmer a bit hard and he'll give in. Or you could actually say this is a magnificent exercise of democracy. I mean, the government has to listen to the people in various interest groups, and this is how democracy should work.
Or you could say, if anybody with half a brain in the Treasury had bothered to go and talk to people that were going to be affected by these proposals written on paper. This is like somebody sitting in the accounts department somewhere going, yeah, what we need to do is to put up car parking charges. So let's put yellow lines all down here, X, Y, and Z. And they've never actually walked the streets. I once sat next to a bloke at a football dinner who worked out the fixtures for the whole of the Premier League. I said, oh, blimey, you must have got a fantastic computer. He said, no, I do it all with pen and pencil, paper and pencil. And, what he was doing was pulling together, okay, so if you've got two Manchester, a Manchester derby, but you've also got, I don't know, gay pride, or you've got fashion week or something like that, and you've got the police elsewhere, you need to put all of those things. Now, anybody with half a brain, and you would think that there might be somebody amongst the Labour Party.
Does Fashion Week need a lot of police?
The fashion police, Jim. You've obviously never heard of them. Well, actually, for those of people who can see you, they can see you've never heard of them. That red with that headphone red is a wrong colour. Anyway, more on Jim's fashion notes next week. But seriously, though, you shouldn't have to be that stupid to not go, hang on, if we do this to pubs, it's probably going to kill them. If we do this to farms, are we looking at? So, you shouldn't have to do U-turns if you have thought it through. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with U-turns. It means you're listening. But of course, the argument then is, oh, okay, so the people with the loudest voices get heard. Now, the farmers and the sort of U-turn on inheritance tax has to be welcomed, and it is very interesting and very indicative that a lot of that credit goes to the quiet diplomacy of Tom Bradshaw, the president of the National Farmers Union, and also the expertise from the Treasury of Emma Reynolds, who took over from Steve Reed as the Secretary of State for Agriculture and Environment. So, that's one way of negotiating, unlike the junior doctors, and that's all fizzled out. But the problem is the government does these things, and you think any fool could have told you that putting up employers' national insurance and minimum wage on small businesses is going to crucify them. Putting up business rates is going to crucify pubs. And of course, now there seems to be, we haven't had an announcement yet, but we're expecting it. But what about the hairdressers? What about the restaurants? What about the cafes? You can't do one lot and not the other.
Yes, well, this is what the downtown campaign that was launched, and as I say, it seems to be having an immediate effect. I'm not saying it was only our Liverpool business campaign that's actually had an effect on the government and is going to have an effect on the government, but this is the Liverpool Business Improvement District and Downtown and Business national campaign to unlock Britain's visitor economy. And the point that Frank would make if he was here, and that wonderful man Bill Addy, who heads up the improvement district, is that it's not just pubs, it's UK's hospitality, retail, tourism and city centre economies. And we're going to hear a lot more during the course of this year from Frank and the downtown team trying to push the government on this. So let us go on to the Chancellor. And it really is an important area. Now, what we've got to wonder is whether the government are going to try and move narrowly on the pubs and hope it'll go away, or whether they're going to take a more holistic approach that Frank and Bill Addy and this campaign is going to have in order to try and get the government to look at the whole issue of this. Just a couple of quotes from Frank, because he's not here. He's saying policy making is too focused on short-term action, adding to cost and complexity and uncertainty to business, and that the visitor economy is being held back by outdated regulation, rising costs, and a worrying instinct in Whitehall to tax first and think later. So do you think we're going to see a narrow addressing of the pubs question, or do you think the government will broaden it out like Frank and Bill want and do something more generally?
I don't think the government's got that imagination. And I think what Frank says is absolutely right. And we've talked very often on this podcast, Jim, about the demise of the high street, wherever you are. And, you can go to I was in Frome in Somerset, which you probably know, last weekend, which is a really lovely, thriving market town with great history and all the rest of it. There are other places around the country where you can say, well, this is surviving. One of the reasons they survive is because their business rateable value is very low. So that means they're not hit by these things. Of course, they've got the other increased costs of, whatever it is, whether it's minimum wage or employers' national insurance and other things. But, if you want to save high streets, and you can argue over and over again that the death of the high street, the dismal high street, is what makes people feel hopeless and fed up and look elsewhere. And it doesn't matter about these, magic pots of money to reinvigorate the high street. The government needs to get a grip. It needs to support small businesses. It needs to support small business owners. The hospitality industry, where they want to create apprenticeships, is dying on its feet. I mean, I live in a seaside town on the Kent coast, and we just about keep going. But, you don't have to go very far. And at this time of year, lots of places are closed. Well, what does that do for the local economy if you can only get a job during the summer months? And that's dependent on the weather, as we know. What does it say to people? Why would you go to that place? And actually, I think the government have shown so little imagination and so little understanding of the impact of these treasury decisions on real people who are trying to run businesses, who are trying to keep their businesses, their families and their towns afloat. They are just completely and utterly out of touch.
But you know why it's being done, because the Chancellor wouldn't grasp the nettle and put up VAT or income tax.
No.
That the government is constantly looking around for what we call bits and pieces. And, the Chancellor would say to you, I can concede to the downtown campaign and let off hotels and the high street and all this sort of stuff. And then where's the money coming from to pay for all the other things? I mean, that's to state the obvious, I know, but I have to put that point.
I know. Well, yes, you can put that point. And, I don't know how long Rachel Reeves can stay in position, because I think she's been an absolute disaster, actually. And I think it's, the deadly combination of her and Keir Starmer, two people, one who seems to be doing a good job, admittedly, abroad, but is more interested and more focused on what's happening around the world. And you could argue that's the right priority. But you've got two people who've got no empathy, no political nous, no understanding of the impact of what they're doing. And they're scrabbling around going, all right, OK, you don't like that. Well, we'll do this then. They had their opportunity on welfare reform. They've got a walloping great majority, and they should have taken those hard decisions early on and gone ahead with it. By now, if the welfare reform bill had gone through, and if they'd had the balls to look at the triple lock on pensions, and some of those other things, and yes, raise VAT, get rid of the fuel duty relief, all of those things they could have done really quickly, and by now people would be beginning to feel less threatened, less desperate.
Right, well, let's look now at the effect of all this on the political situation. I mean, it seems that there are some indications in the New Year polls that reform might have peaked. They're just a sign that it's coming off the peak now, because there's more focus on reform's economic policies rather than immigration. They're always going to win on immigration, but when people start to look at their economic performance and in their performance in local authorities that they control, that they may have just peaked. The sort of big news is that the Conservatives, and we're talking smaller numbers here because Reform still have a substantial lead, but the Conservatives have overtaken Labour, and that Kemi Badenoch, she did a big interview at the weekend with a presenter whose name I shan't mention because it just increases your blood pressure, unjustifiably, I may say so, but anyway, we'll discuss that some other time, have edged ahead of Labour. And then the Greens have had a bit of an upturn, and the Lib Dems slightly downturn. So what's your take on the political situation as we go into the new year?
I think it's interesting that the Tories are moving, albeit, slowly, but it does mean they're not quite dead. And I think, we should welcome that, because we do need an effective and good opposition. That is, fundamental to democracy. Reform, I don't know. I mean, personally, I have doubts about the value of keep churning out the well-rehearsed arguments and claims about what Nigel Farage may or may not have said when he was a kid at school nearly 50 years ago. And I think it's far better to be focusing on their performance in local government and their economic and other plans. I think they are still attractive to people for the reasons that we've said, the dismal high streets, the apparent inability of the government to get anything right, and the failure of the Conservatives over the last 14 years. I think that 14 years thing is fading a little bit. And I think, I'm sure Kemi Badenoch will breathe a sigh of relief. And, everybody's looking to the May elections, which of course are only 20 weeks away, and the elections in Scotland and Wales, which will be significant and interesting. I think if Reform do well in those local elections, then it's going to be very hard for them to be written off completely. But the more people they have in local councils, the more inept you can see time and time again. And interestingly, they were going to slash spending and cut council tax. Well, nearly every single authority that's in Reform control is putting up council tax this year, which, any fool could have told them, of course you're going to have to, because you've got the walloping great cost of adult social care, which you are statutorily obliged to pay for. So there's all of those sort of things which are a wake-up call. The Greens, interestingly, don't seem to have gone much further in their initial bounce from Zach Polanski. And the Liberal Democrats are continuing to just stay steady. Now, there will be those in the party who think that actually they should have capitalised more. They got 72 MPs. Is Ed Davey a bit tired? Is it time for a change of leader? And so on and so forth. But actually, what I think the Liberal Democrats are doing is what they're quite good at, and they've got the numbers to do it, is they're being steadfast on the things that really matter. So Europe, where the Lib Dems stand. They're not having a fight with anybody except for, the Tories and Reform. So keep pushing on that. I think Ed Davis has been quite good on some of the really serious issues.
And of course, he doesn't pull his punches on Donald Trump.
No, he doesn't. And I think that's the other thing. I think there are a couple of other things going on. And I think this goes back to, the foreign affairs thing that, of course, Keir Starmer needs to be there, and he has done a really good job, and he has managed so far to contain the worst of Donald Trump. But I think there is increasing anger, certainly amongst many of the backbenchers, but also around the country, that people don't like the way Donald Trump behaves. He's a coarse bully. And I think, people are looking to Keir Starmer to perhaps stand up to him a bit more. I mean, our Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, lovely woman, but absolutely completely useless, a chocolate teapot. And I think, when you look at the government as a whole, you think, OK, well, you've got a prime minister. OK, we know where we are with that. Rachel Reeves, who's spectacularly failed, a foreign secretary who, is absolutely out of her depth. David Lammy, deputy prime minister. Where is the real oomph of people apart from Wes Streeting and Pat McFadden? And of course you've got a safe pair of hands like
John Healey. John Healey's good.
John Healey, yes, although he would have been more sensible wearing a hat going to Ukraine in the snow. Because as you and I know from media training, what do people notice? They notice your tie blowing in the wind or your jangly bracelet. So you're standing there in the freezing cold with snow up to your knees with a bare, bald head. And most people won't have listened to what he said. They'd have thought, silly arse, why didn't he put a hat on? It's optics. And I think, you've got some, Liz Kendall actually is doing quite a good job. Peter Kyle is doing quite a good job. But there's nobody there that actually is giving you that feeling of let's go forward. Because if we're going to deal with the things that you and I discussed earlier in this podcast about the real challenges and the threat to peace, the possibility of war and all of those things, we need somebody that people are going to go, all right, I'm behind him, I trust him. And I don't think the way the government's behaving at the moment is, nor do I think Kemi Badenoch's fulfilling that role either.
One last thing we must talk about, and it's a fact of life that an awful lot of parents, they've only got a certain amount of bandwidth to care about various issues, and with respect to all the things we've been talking about, possibly the cost of living being an exception, but all the international stuff will be well in the back of their minds while they worry about their children's safety online. We've had all this stuff about Grok last week, and mounting pressure on the government to fall in line with the Australians and ban mobile phones and social media for under 16s. One senses it's another of these issues where the government is being slow to react. I mean, I look forward to your views on the merits of the case, but one has a sort of feeling that for whatever reason they're sort of saying, well, Ofcom are looking at it and so on. But I think talking about chocolate teapots, I tend to put Ofcom in that category in this respect, that this mounting public pressure for something to be done, this, as we've referred to it before, this obscene machinery which has affected both our children's lives and also our political discourse, whereby the more extreme pictures or things that you say, the more clicks, the more people want to advertise, and there's more money for these out of control multinational companies. I mean, the whole way in which this whole edifice has stolen up upon us over the last 10-20 years, and what national governments can do about it. So what do you think about this? Do you think the government are going to move?
They need to, but given that they actually still haven't put in place the Supreme Court ruling on single-sex spaces and gender identity, because Bridget Phillipson is apparently looking at the costs to business. This is while they're crippling business with business rates and everything else. It's absolute nonsense. Of course, people will find their way around a ban. They, 'twas ever thus. They've done it around alcohol, tobacco, all sorts of things, drugs and what have you. The thing about a ban on under 16s that the Australians have brought in is that it allows parents. It's much easier to say it's against the law. In the same way as, I want to drive the car. No, you can't. You're only 6. It does give parents a bit of backing. But on the other hand, there's a report out today, Jim, which I found, call me old-fashioned and an old fuddy-duddy, because you and I are of a different generation.
Heaven forbid. Even though you've been rude about my headphones and jumper.
No, only the colour of your jumper. Just decide, are you going in the red family or the pink family? Anyway, but it was something like 98% of parents allow their toddlers to be on screen. And guess what? It slows down their verbal development, because they're not interacting, they're just watching. So, and you sort of think, hang on a minute, there is a point. You say, oh, it's crept up on us. And yes, it has to a certain extent in public discourse. But if you sit a kid in front of a screen and you don't talk to it, well, don't be surprised when it goes to school that it doesn't know how to use a book and can't speak. There's a responsibility of parents as well. And at that early age, it's much easier. Once you get to teenage years and everybody else has got a phone and everybody else is doing this, that and the other, then actually I think a ban on under 16s is absolutely fine. With regard to the whole sort of social media network, and as you know, I am not on social media, and it's amazing. I still function as a fully compos mentis human being without having to resort to X. All the time it remains anonymous. You don't know who you are engaging with and whether that Twitter feed or that X feed is actually a real person or it's coming from an algorithm in a box factory in Russia or China. And I still maintain the old-fashioned idea you could send in a letter to the editor, name and address withheld, or you could call up a radio phone and you'd still have to provide your phone number and the phone operator would call you back to confirm that it was real. Now, you could bring in that, stop the anonymity. You don't have to publish it, but the company, and I think there's a much wider argument here about the responsibility of these big tech companies who are now publishers. And Ofcom, I completely agree with you. They are worse than useless. They have got no teeth. They are absolutely pathetic and have shown to be on so many occasions, and that's right across the board. GB News, which I appear on a regular basis, as you know, but it is a party political broadcast on behalf of reform most of the time, with no attempt at balance. The BBC has got it wrong on many occasions, as we know. And Ofcom have got the rules. Liz Kendall made it really clear at the weekend. They've got the rules, they've got the power, the government will back them. They need to do something about these things, and the government needs to act quickly, because again, it's another thing that people are worrying about and thinking, help, I need some help. Well, get in there, government, and do something to help.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. Thanks also to our producer, Francesca King. We'll be back next week in the safe hands of Frank McKenna. But in the meantime, stay warm.